dam, built BART, built that great big dig project in Boston that's worked out so well, and was also, along with Halliburton, one of the two companies that got the big no-bid contract in Iraq from the Bush administration. This was a very powerful, you couldn't find a bigger Goliath than Bechtel.
So here they are, privatizing the water. Talk about the different forces from the farmers who would now be charged for irrigating their land, the cocaleras, who were headed by, well, then the cocalera leader, Evo Morales, the factory workers in town led by Oscar Oliveira.
In some respects, you can say that the water revolt really began right here in Tiquipaya, because this is an agricultural community. This is the community where I live. Most of my neighbors are cows or corn. And obviously, irrigation is very important. And it wasn't just the city water system in Cochabamba that was privatized. The government had plans as well to require these rural communities to get permits for these water systems that they had built and managed on their own without any help from the government. So the rural people were the first ones to really call for a revolt, and then they allied with the people in the city, the factory workers, others, environmentalists. The cocaleros from the other end of Cochabamba joined in, and you know, you're going to be in the city for a week, and in the video, I think people will see this is not a tiny city. This is a city of 500,000 people. This is, you know, almost the size of San Francisco. Imagine this city for a week without any cars. None. This city was shut down by its people, tight as a drum, for a week in order to kick Bechtel out.
So the farmers went to the factory workers.
The farmers went to the factory workers.
And said, join us.
And said, join us. Environmentalists. You had
Oscar Oliveira. Talk about his significance.
Well, you know, Oscar in many ways is the symbolic leader of the water revolt, and you can't understate the amount of courage that people had. Remember, when they led this rebellion, they were arrested. Some of them were put on a plane and sent to a jail in the Beni in the jungle. I remember in the night that the governor of the state went on television live at midnight and announced he was resigning because he did not want to be responsible for a bloodbath. And for the hours that followed, we were getting calls all night of the police had just busted down the door of Oscar Oliveira's mother's house looking for Oscar. So the courage that people like Oscar and others had, it's easy to forget 10 years later, especially the city looks so peaceful. They were up against the Pinochet of Bolivia.
And then where did Evo Morales, of course not president then,
right.
But head of the, well, talk about the cocaleras, who they are.
Well, up until the water revolt, the really prominent and most visible social movement in Bolivia were the cocaleros, the coca growers in the Chapari region of this department of Cochabamba, who had been fighting the U.S. war on drugs and the repression of the U.S. war on drugs for many years. And Evo Morales, a cocalero, was their leader. The cocaleros and Evo joined in this because the water revolt became about more than just water. This is a country, as we talked about in Dignity and Defiance, that for 10 years was the lab rat for the Washington Consensus. They did it all. They privatized oil, gas, the airline, the electric company, the trains, everything. Water was the end of the line. Water was the straw that broke the camel's back. And I think a lot of movements that were upset with all of these foreign-imposed changes to Bolivia's life and economics saw this as the moment to challenge this in a way that was unprecedented in Bolivia. And so that's why I think you had other groups like the cocaleros. I mean, they weren't directly impacted, obviously, by the water privatization, but you know the story about the three blind men and the elephant, you know, and each one grabs a piece and they think they see a different way. Everybody saw the same elephant, even though they came at it from a different place, and the elephant was for and control of their lives.
When we come back from break, we're going to go to the streets of Cochabamba with Marcela Oliveira, who was in the streets 10 years ago,
right.
A well-known activist herself. She's the sister of Oscar Oliveira. But can you finally talk about what happened afterwards, right after this period 10 years ago, where, well, it was just after the Battle of Seattle,
right.
That all of this was coming to a head. And right afterwards was a major march in Washington, right. Taking on the World Bank and IMF and globalization, right. And how Oscar Oliveira ended up being there, and how Cochabamba became this global symbol.
Well, you know, it was just chance. I remember getting a call in the middle of the water revolt from a friend of mine in Western Massachusetts who said, I just read your alert, because, you know, we were the only people writing from the streets at the time, and he said, I just read your alert in front of 1,000 students in Ralph Nader who were mobilizing to go to Washington, and they all cheered. He said, well, what are 1,000 students going to Washington for? It was the first time I'd heard about these April mobilizations. And Tom Cruise and I, a colleague of mine here in Bolivia, cooked up this idea to have Oscar invited to go to Washington, Oscar Oliveira, and get that into the press here in Bolivia so that the government might leave his hands off it. And on Tuesday, when the water revolt ended, Oscar said, yo pienso que debemos ir. I think we should go. And we turned to Oscar and we said, you know, you have two problems. One, you don't have a passport, and second, you don't have a visa to get into the United States. Can you imagine that the U.S. ambassador is going to be real excited to give Oscar Oliveira a visa to go to the United States? She said, es Bolivia, todo es posible. You know, everything's possible. So he goes to the immigration office, and he comes back the same day with a passport. He says, yeah, the guy who runs immigration, I went to high school with him, which is just so cochabambino, you know? And then he was, the next day, sitting in the U.S. Embassy in La Paz, waiting for his interview, and I got a phone call from, I think it was the Gannett correspondent for South America, who says, can you get me an interview with Oscar Oliveira? And so I called Oscar on his cell phone. I said, hey, how about this? You give him his interview. If he'll call the U.S. ambassador and say that you're sitting in the lobby and see if they'll give you a visa. And he walked out the next day, or that day, with his visa. Well, and so he was in Washington. I'll never forget this. We were walking at the front of the march in Washington that Saturday. And, you know, Oscar was kind of small, and so, you know, he barely saw over the banner that he was holding. And I said, Oscar, it's your first time in the United States. What do you think? And he says to me in Spanish, he says, well, you know, it looks like Cochabamba. There's young people and police everywhere.
Jim Shultz, I want to thank you for being with us.
He's
co-founder of the Democracy Center and editor of Dignity and Defiance, Stories from Bolivia's Challenge to Globalization. When we come back, we go to the streets of Cochabamba. Stay with us.